what is the view from the outside as the country takes to the polls? What sort of market or investor approval could we likely see once this election is over? The research group Intellidex has polled dozens of investment decision makers at local and offshore asset managers. Emerging market analyst Peter Attard Montalto of Intellidex joins us now via Skype from London. Peter, good day. Pushing through economic reforms is by far the biggest issue for investors, and I see most of those surveyed believe that if the ANC gets a big enough majority, President Ramaphosa will push them through.
Well, there seemed to be a little bit of scepticism of that. We sort of saw, I think, a slight split in the results where people thought that Ramaphosa probably would get a mandate from these results, being able to put in place his own policy sort of program, but actually delivering on higher growth. We asked investors if maybe growth could get back to, say, 3.5% by the end of the new parliamentary term. There was a lot more scepticism, with only a third probability put on that by investors. So I think there has been a degree more scepticism sinking in on the ability to reform after the election, even if the ANC gets a pretty good vote share.
And I suppose he has had a generally tough fight back from some quarters of the ANC to keep some of those populist policies alive. And, you know, the question is whether that's likely to change with a good enough victory at the election.
Well, exactly. We have to remember there's been some strategic ground given back on these points, in particular land at that famous NEC meeting in June, July last year, where the president backed that, I think probably against his own personal opinions. We've seen now the president back Saab nationalisation, which we all know is not a problem in and of itself, but is a key first stage strategic victory being handed basically to the sort of forces of rent extraction, if you like, within the ANC. And I think this is ultimately the point: is if you keep making these sorts of compromise on things like the Credit Amendment Act as well, then you can best maybe only take a sort of one step forward, one step back on reform, and as a result, potential growth remains in the new parliament at best zero per capita, so around 1.7 to 2%. In real terms.
So Gauteng is the richest province and the economic hub, Peter. What's the outlook for that province in terms of control here?
Well, investors are totally confused, to be honest, by the spread in polling. Obviously, at a national level, we saw a 10 percentage point spread between IRR and Ipsos. And I think, particularly at the Gauteng level, it's just simply too close to call. I think what's been surprising investors onshore and offshore in the last couple of days, basically, is the fact that an EFF coalition with the ANC is actually much higher than many people thought. And I think that in particular comes from the fact that even if the ANC doesn't have to, let's say they get 49.9, they probably will choose to go with the EFF because of the long-term dynamic within the ANC, to see EFF as sort of really ANC in the long term, and a splinter group that should be brought back in the fold. And given some of these more strategic plays by people like David Mabuza around EFF as well, I think that's what's most concerning to investors. Let's not forget that provinces have a much greater leeway to do economic policy, to do things like land reform, to do things like economic policy, and so the EFF would have a more interesting hand to play than they have done at the municipal level so far after 2016.
And we haven't really had a fantastic record when it comes to coalition governments, have we?
Well, exactly. I mean, we should remember that last time around the EFF never really entered coalition government. They extracted certain conditionality. There's been a lot of debate over that conditionality, particularly what maybe they were given up in terms of procurement or contracting. We obviously saw the collapse of Nelson Mandela Bay and the coalition there. But I think what the coalitions that we may see after this election, particularly in Gauteng, will be more interesting in the sense that the EFF may well actually want a seat at the table and actually be able to wield power in actual MEC positions.
Peter, those crucial finance minister and public enterprises minister posts, I mean, does it matter if they get new deployments after this election or not?
Well, in theory, no, but the problem is there are so few people that we can imagine would be in those positions and be credible. And the real challenge I've had over the last 6 months or so, talking to the ANC, talking to government, is trying to identify succession planning in these posts. Who would come next? What are the credible candidates for the next iteration? But also who is going to be finance minister in 10 years' time? Those sorts of questions which we do need to track for investors. And there simply are very few answers to that. And our simple view is that because of the lack of alternatives, Tito Mboweni and Pravin Gordhan will both continue in those roles. And let's not forget there's so much at stake, particularly straight after the election, when an urgent Eskom bailout is going to be required by the time of the Eskom results at the end of June. And as a result, I see both of those personalities staying in place, battling it out for basically the future of Eskom and what it means for the fiscus.
And Peter, finally, just taking a look back, there was the surge in both business and consumer confidence at the time when Ramaphosa took leadership of both the ANC and the country at the start of 2018. Those growth reforms never really surfaced as anticipated, and as a result, you saw business and consumer confidence dip quite sharply. I'm wondering whether or not we can expect that same swing if people, or investors in particular, just don't see that envisaged change.
Well, there's a lot more skepticism now, certainly, and I think the real challenge is what you actually say in Ramaphosa's third SONA. He'll have a SONA in maybe the start of June in Parliament to start the new parliamentary season. And what do you actually say? I mean, there was so much repetition between the 2018 and 2019 SONA. A lot of the huge effort that went into writing the 2019 SONA, wrapping in people like Nick Spall on education, those ideas are now already out there. And I think it's actually very hard to keep that momentum going, really. And simply what we need, investors, what companies need to see is implementation. The number one issue is visas and fundamental reform at DHA. There's also obviously issues around spectrum auctions. There's issues around obviously Eskom, but just simple implementation. And the simplest thing to watch, I think, is what goes on at DTI and the promise of putting in place a new targeting regime for climbing up the doing business rankings of the World Bank. And that should be a very simple thing to do. And we basically look for these things after the election and that real implementation to come.
Well, thanks very much indeed. Peter Attard, Montalto of Intellidex, they're speaking to us from London.